Hi guys, welcome back to another video, or your first video here, I don't know. Welcome if you're new here, welcome either way. This is going to be my, again, quite late December wrap-up. Oh, not technically that late. Anyway, it's going to be my December wrap-up part 2. And I will just get into those because I have a lot to talk about. Next, we have quite a number of 4 stars, and some of these I'm debating upping to a 4.5. I'm thinking of rereading a couple of these to cement them in my mind, but I'll stay at 4 stars for now. The first one being The River of Teeth by Sarah Gailey. This was just really fascinating. It's based on a real historical, not even event, but someone in the American government a while ago was like, oh, I know how to solve the meat crisis. Why don't we just bring over a bunch of hippos and breed hippos, or let hippos breed wild so we have a meat source? Not realising that's a really stupid idea, and the fact that hippos are incredibly aggressive animals. And that never came to pass, but that was something that he had an idea of. So this book follows the American West if hippos had been released wild. So this society follows as if history had gone down that path. So hippos are being bred for different traits and different conditions, for different temperaments. They're almost being bred like horses, so the colouring is different, the sizing is very different, the shape and temperament are very different. So we are following a band of outlaws who have been hired to do a job, and they are all riding their hippos into this area in the US. It was just so weird, but really interesting. And I loved all the, like, in such a short time, it managed to portray so many different companions and relationships, and there were some really shocking moments. The stakes were pretty high as well. I find that with shorter books, there can be the tendency to have very low stakes, but the stakes were pretty high as well. I will definitely be buying my own copy of this, and yeah, it was just really enjoyable. Also non-binary rep. Next, we have 3 books in a short romance series. I honestly didn't expect that much from these, given the covers, but I think I'd got to a point in script where, because I'd been reading a certain amount, it put a bunch of my to-read list onto this will be available next month. So I was like, okay, I'll just look through what's left. And I'm honestly considering rereading this whole series and possibly even bumping it up to a 5, because of how much this has really stuck with me, stuck in my mind, and like I remember so much about these characters and about their relationships. So it is a trilogy. So we have Double Up, Rough Road, and Roller Girl. It follows 3 different relationships, all centering around a community that does a lot of water sports. So in the first book, you follow a guy who, in order to be closer to his sibling, decides to enter a competition and hires a former champion, a former local champion, in order to train him for this. The second follows a guy who's incredibly kinky but doesn't really feel like he's not even capable of love, but deserving of love, and how he meets someone a lot younger who he's very wary to get into a relationship with, but they just strike it off so well, and about how their political opinions differ, and like, can they make it work in terms of having a relationship and being together with their different political opinions. And then the third one follows another of the former, I think it's wakeboarding champions, how she then discovers a new sport and enters a roller derby team, and how she has a relationship with the captain, and whether or not they can make that work while also having slight power dynamics, because they're not employed by each other, but also the fact that favoritism within the team and rivalries within the team, whether or not they can make that relationship work. So I found all these characters incredibly strong. I found all of the books incredibly sex positive. They had a lot of really candid conversations. Like, for example, in the first book, one of the guys is like he perceives the other man as a top, and he's like, but I don't want to bottom, is that going to be a problem? And they just have a conversation about it, like, I don't want to do this, I'm happy for that, blah, blah, blah. And I just thought that was really nice to see. The second book, the main character, Eddie, is incredibly kinky and has very specific tastes, and just the lack of shame in that book. And I thought they had such healthy conversations about it. And I don't know if this is just me being stupid, but like, I'd never considered, I always thought that dominant people, like, that would be paired with being a sadist if you were into SM, and then being a submissive person would then mean that you were more of a masochist in those roles. And I never thought that people could be swapped. So Eddie is very much a dominant sadist, and just how they talk about what they want in their relationship and with the sex that they're having. And I just thought it was such healthy conversations about that. And also then you have some trans rep in the third book, and it's about trans women in very female dominated sports, and it was just a fantastic commentary in that way. All of them were just so good, and I am possibly moving up their rating. I'll have to reread them, but they were just really, really interesting. Each of them was very, very short, but I thought that this is what I think for me is like my standard for short queer romance. I think that this is some of the best that I've come across so far, and I would highly recommend. Next, we have a series that I continued in this month, and that is Eldest, which is the second book in the Eragon series, or the Inheritance cycle. So this is a reread for me. I read the Inheritance cycle probably as it was coming out, and then never finished the last book. And I still intended to finish it. I still want to know how it ends, but I couldn't go into the last book having not reread any of the series. So this series is about a young farm boy called Eragon who discovers a strange stone in the woods one day, and it turns out to be a dragon egg, and it sends him off on this adventure. Is this series the most thought-provoking, unique thing ever? No, it's not. And also the fact that this series was started by a 14-year-old, and just the skill that this guy was able to craft these stories. So they're a really enjoyable read for me. In reading them, I've remembered a lot of the plot, so none of the surprises were surprising at this point because of the fact that I've read them before. But I do intend to finish out the series. It was just daunting with how big each of the books gets. This is almost like 650 to 700 pages, and then Brissinger is a lot longer, and then Inheritance is a lot longer than that. But I'm really happy to be rereading this series. It was still a solid read. I still really enjoyed it, and I really hope to finish it out in 2023. I am so close to finishing it. Next, we have a poetry collection, and that is Disintegrate Dissociate by, oh, excuse me, I think it's Ariel Twist. Anyway, this poetry collection I found really, really powerful. It's by a Indigenous trans woman, and a lot of the poems are about their experiences being queer, being trans, being Indigenous, and the intersections of all of those things, and the struggles, but also the beauty and the culture. And I just think it was such a powerful read. I really recommend it. Next, we have another one of these Audible short things. So essentially, why do I keep on saying essentially? And that is Lily Savage, the live show. So this is a recording of one of Lily Savage's shows, who is the drag persona of Paul O'Grady, and I just find her incredibly funny. There was some songs, there was a lot of different types of humour in it. She had some other people involved with some of the skits, and I just thought it was really, really funny. I'm a big fan of Paul O'Grady in general, so this was just a really good read. Next we have volume 1 and volume 2 of Dangerous Convenience Store, which is a queer comic that I read on Manta, Webtoon, one of these apps. And what I like about it is that there's very clearly a plan for the story to finish. And I know that sounds a bit weird, like, oh, if you enjoyed it, then why do you want it to finish? But I feel like with some of these series, an author might have a plan for like a series or two, or a volume or two, and then because it does well, they then decide to keep on extending it, even if they, like, the plot might suffer or the characters might do something more out of character. So I just like the fact that volume 1 you have these two characters meeting and really identifying their own feelings, and then in volume 2 that changes and there is a plan for the final volume 3. It follows a character who really needs a job, gets a job at a convenience store in quite a rough area, and not falls into the mafia life, but essentially starts forming a connection to and relationship with someone in like a mafia style situation. I think it's called Yatsuka in Japan. I don't know if Korea has a different name for that, but it was a really interesting read and I can't wait to finish it. And then my final 4-star that I read in December was What White People Can Do Next. It did have a tagline, I can't quite remember what it was. This was so interesting. I got this on Audible and it's a point of view that I haven't really seen before in terms of racial commentary. I'm not sure I agree with everything that was said, but it was putting forward the idea that the concept of having black people and white people is a very new concept. It wasn't really a thing until people wanted to be able to be seen as superior to others and to dehumanize others and to oppress others. So her idea was that we can't truly end racism until we stop seeing these categories. She had a lot of really interesting points to say. I personally think that having labels for things, especially when someone is labeling themselves, I think can be really powerful to a person, can give you a sense of identity and community. I also feel like when trying to identify people who need more support than others or have shared experiences in certain aspects of life, I do think that having some sort of identification or identity does help with that. But it was just a really interesting aspect on how people see race and the concepts of white and black. So really, really fascinating. Highly recommend. I'll probably reread it at some point to really, I think, digest all the points that she was trying to make. And finally, I have my 5 stars, which again, I have quite a few this month, so, which I was really happy with. First of all, I have I Hate Fairyland Volume 3. I just love this graphic novel series. I think it's so excellent. It takes place in a world where children from our world are dropped into fairyland or find their way to fairyland. When they are children, they spend an adventure, they spend a day, couple of days finding their key and going home. And they go home having had a wonderful adventure in fairyland. And we follow Gertrude, who found her way to fairyland, and then it's been over 30 years and has never found her key, and she's not been able to grow as a person. Not as a person, but like her body hasn't grown. She's stayed in the body of a 8-ish-year-old child, and she's just turned more and more murderous and just done with the world. And in this book you see her trying a different tack in terms of attempting to get home. I really enjoyed the development of her companionship with her little guide, it's like a little conscience, I guess, from Pinocchio. But I really just enjoyed where the story is going, and I can't wait to continue with the series. Volume 4 used to be the final volume, but I know that the author has recently announced that there'll be a volume 5. Very, very excited to see where that goes. And yeah, 5 stars. Next we have the first 2 volumes in a trilogy called the Will Darling trilogy, or the Will Darling something trilogy. And these were just so excellent. So these are historical fiction novels, but not about learning about a historical time. It's more in terms of like the hijinks of the characters and the just hilarity and ridiculousness that ensues. So in the first book, you're following Will Darling, who has come back from the war and managed to inherit a family member's bookshop. And then he starts getting some dangerous characters coming knocking round, and he's like, what was this family member like? What was he tangled up in? Because it's clear that people are coming in expecting him to know something or to have something, and he starts being in danger, and he meets someone who he doesn't quite know whether he can trust, but will have to trust enough to be able to solve this mystery and to, you know, get these people off his back, essentially. So I really enjoyed these first two books, and I do completely intend to finish out the trilogy. It's just so enjoyable. I love the fact that these characters are morally grey. Will, having been in the war and having killed people, it's clearly changed him as a person since before and after. And he also has to admit to himself about how he views his own skills and how, like, he really has that introspection of realizing that he enjoys violence to a certain extent. And I found that exploration really interesting. The development of the relationship he builds with, I am blanking on that other main character, but that queer relationship I just thought was so interesting in terms of having feelings that he's confronting while also recognizing that this person is really, really difficult to trust. And because of the short time span of the books, it's also like, it's not an unrealistic character arc. These people don't change each other to a ridiculous degree. And I really enjoyed the way that the characters stayed true to themselves throughout the relationship, I'll say. I won't go into the plot of the second book because I think that will spoil. It's not too related to the first book, but it's kind of related to the first book. So I won't spoil anything, but I highly recommend, if you like sort of the type of queer historical fiction that is more based around hijinks and fun, things like this, The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue. Also another book I read fairly recently, The Queer Principles of Kit Webb. Also The Henchman of Zenda, I think, would be a good comp title to that. It's that sort of vibe. Next we have 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. So this book talks about Canadian law that was written up in order to get rid of the Indian problem, essentially to murder or wipe out the Indigenous population. And it basically goes through some of the very key changes that were made in terms of, on paper, how to improve the legislation, but in practice, how it continued and continues to control the Indigenous population of Canada. I've never lived in Canada. I don't know a lot about Canada, so this was really to inform myself about the situation, and I felt this was just really, really excellent. It's quite a short novel, so I think it makes it very accessible in terms of, the author themselves said that if they were to go through every part of those laws of the Indian Act and also all the changes that have been made, it would be thousands and thousands of pages and no one would ever want to read it. So I feel like it takes those laws and makes it really accessible to the average person. I also found that the audiobook was a lot easier for me to read, especially with a lot of the legal jargon used when talking about the law specifically. So I highly recommend, like, even if you're not Canadian, like myself, I think that this really sheds a light on some of the horrific histories that you don't often get to hear about. And finally, I finished out the Laini Taylor Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy. So this is the final one, Dreams of Gods and Monsters, and I just love this trilogy so much. I feel like each book was just as good as the previous one. This is taking my second last book that I'm talking about, because there's a novella that goes with this series that I also read and gave 5 stars. I don't think I can tell you much about the plot of this without spoiling the rest of it. So in terms of the first book, it's a very typical young adult paranormal romance setup, but it just did not fall into any of the outdated, overdone tropes that I thought it might fall into. And this is really what paranormal romance could have been in its heyday, and is just such a standout. So we follow Kaoru, who is trying to live a normal life, but also does jobs for these monsters who have been pretty much her only family. She meets an angel and things about her past get revealed, and you find more about this world, and it was just so fantastic. Kaoru is such a strong main character. She's not just another character that is a reader insert. She has strong will. She has a strong will and opinions. Her best friend is truly a best friend to her. Their relationship is so good and is not just dropped when the series continues. It's not a story of a relationship with a background of war. It's a story about war with a background of a relationship, and it has really interesting themes about how violence breeds more violence and about who benefits from war. And I just think that this ended so perfectly. There were some characters introduced at this point. I don't know whether or not the full trilogy was planned before Laini Taylor started writing it. I think I would have liked those characters introduced in some capacity earlier on in the series, although I can kind of tell why they weren't, because maybe if they'd been introduced in that capacity, they could have been seen as superfluous plot lines at that point. But I can understand why they were added at the time that they were, because there was no way, again, I'm trying to say these things without spoiling anything. There was no way at this point in the series that the reader could have found out about that information from the perspectives of the characters we were already introduced to. There's quite a number of things in here that get explained that were sort of longer forming plot threads that were introduced in the first 2 novels, and I loved how they all came together, and I loved how it ended in the way that it did. It didn't just end in this little bow, and I was a bit worried for a second that there was going to be a love triangle, and I loved how that got resolved as well. Just every time that I thought, oh no, it's going to fall into X trope or Y trope, it just didn't. And this was just fantastic and a really worthy sort of finale to this trilogy. And the other thing that I read to do with that trilogy this month was the short novella that was following Susanna, who is the best friend of Kaoru, and it follows how she and her boyfriend first met. And it didn't feel unnecessary. It was a really, really beautiful short story. I love Susanna. She is such a firecracker of a person. And I just love the fact that Laini Taylor didn't shy away from having what could be perceived as abrasive characters to be in the heads of. And it just worked for me. I thought it was great. And I loved getting that perspective as well. And there you have it. Those are some of the books. Obviously, I don't have copies of everything that I read in the month of December. So I'll take a quick thumbnail. And yeah, I'm really happy with how I rounded out the reading year. I think I read some really good things this month, and I'm just excited for how my reading will continue in 2023. So this won't be the last video about the books that I read during 2022, but this will be my last wrap up of the year. So I will see you in my next video. Bye.